I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to a special EWTN Bookmark with Father George W. Rutler. The book Calm in Chaos, Catholic Wisdom for Anxious Times, published by our friends at Ignatius Press. And Father Rutler joins us from New York City. Great to see you again, Father Rutler.
Thank you, Doug.
So what's the weather like in Hell's Kitchen these days?
Well, we don't really have weather in Manhattan. You have to realize that. We're impervious to those things.
Now, speaking of not being impervious, though, to things, we're talking about Calm in Chaos, Catholic Wisdom for Anxious Times. Are these more anxious times than we've had before?
I think so. I mean, we've been through, in modern times, 2 world wars, countless other wars, all kinds of crises, but I think we are participating now in a perfect cultural storm. I think that there's a legitimate thesis which holds that about every 500 years there's a special kind of challenge. First 500 years you had the collapse of the Roman Empire. 500 years later you had the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. Then fast forward another 500 years you had the Protestant revolt. Now, all those challenges, political, ecclesiastical, theological, seem to be combining in a mix of profound moral confusion.
Right. Now, in the beginning of the book, you've got a quote from Acts, "Seeing then that these things cannot be contradicted, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash." Did you pick that out?
Yes. A panic is just a lack of a trust in God's providence. And if we look for quick solutions, we're just going to make the situation worse. I think where I am, right behind me, you can see the Brooklyn Bridge, which was a phenomenon when it was built. It was the tallest structure in the United States at the time, harder it is to believe. And just a few days after it opened, someone shouted, "Oh, the bridge is collapsing," and there was a panic. People were killed. Well, that's sort of an unhelpful way to explain things to people. Right. If we act rashly, what happens? We lose the gift of logic. Christ is the Logos. He's the logic of the universe. And if we don't put him at the center of every solution, things do spin out of control. And I think that explains much of the problem we're facing today. Right. It's no mistake that we have a crisis in the church and in our general culture, in politics. And many people, younger people, have been living in a cultural bubble in their schools. They've been taught lies. They've been told the world is not the way it really is. And suddenly, when reality impinges, what happens? The young people have to run and look for safe spaces, psychologists, hot cocoa, and
you mentioned the line about the
therapy
hot cocoa
dogs and that kind of thing.
Right. Well, let me ask you: the actual pieces that are in this book. There's several pieces in here. Where did they come from? Were they written for this book, or were they other material that was put together in this book?
Most of them were originally published as essays. I think the majority of them from the Crisis magazine, which is online. Some go back about 20 years. So when people say, "Oh, this is a very timely book," because we're trying to stay calm in chaos, well, I didn't really fully anticipate the dire situation we find ourselves in now. But every generation has its challenges, and in every generation our Lord is saying what he said when he rose from the dead: peace, calm down.
Right. Well, you mentioned a part right at the beginning. You say the sure way to start a panic is to tell people not to panic. And then you go on to mentioning about the idea of Pope Sylvester II, who was the one who told everybody not to think that the world was ending in the year 1000, and everybody thought he was a deluded optimist. But then you also talk about, in contrast, in 1914, when Sir Edward Grey said that the lamps were going out all over Europe, everybody thought he was a pessimist, but you say those lights have never been turned back on again.
Well, we never recovered culturally from the Great War, as it was known then. Nobody dreamt that there would be another world war after that. But you cannot destroy such a large number of young men in one generation and expect any kind of significant recovery. Think of all the scientific inventions, all the philosophies, all the great saints that were destroyed, never allowed to live. So I emphasize, though, that there's a difference between optimism and hope. The great writer G.K. Chesterton said that a pessimist is an unhappy idiot, and an optimist is a happy idiot. But both are living wishes. Hope is a theological virtue, comes from God, theos, and that means that it's based not on sentiment, but on fact, and that fact is trust in God. After all, when our Lord was in the boat on the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a storm, the apostles panicked, and he just calmed things just by uttering his instruction to the sea. Our Lord is the Lord of the universe, and as long as we unite with him, follow him, he works his purposes out. And that's not vain optimism, because he did tell the disciples that they would suffer very much, but they would also reap a great reward. Problem we have now is, and it's in the church, a lack of faith in the power of Christ.
Right. You actually say that errors in matters of faith usually are the result not of willful contempt for Christ, but of a failure to recall and understand the trial of human experience. What do you mean?
Well, there's a difference between stupidity and ignorance. Stupidity is just not being able to think. Ignorance is simply not knowing things. Everybody's ignorant about something. I don't think I'm all that stupid, but I'm very ignorant about computers, for instance, and so on. Our Lord's the truth, and he lifts the veil of ignorance by leading us step by step deeper into the mysteries of life, so that we're no longer puzzled, but we're thrilled by the supernatural realities that surround us. A puzzle is just something that confuses. A mystery is a deep truth that our Lord leads us into a step by step. But the big problem we're dealing with today is ignorance of history. It's appalling how many people do not know where they came from culturally. Recently, on July 4th, a television reporter was interviewing younger people on the beach and asked, why do we have July 4th? None could answer. Instead of history now, we have polemics in school, and we see the consequences. That I said before, people running into safe spaces to avoid reality. I think if someone from ages past came into our culture, one thing that would strike them is how elderly our culture is. That seems a strange thing to say, but the fact is that something like over half of everybody in human history who lived over the age of 60 is alive now.
Wow. Okay.
And if we don't know where we came from, of course we're not going to know where we are going. But being young is no excuse for evading reality.
Right.
We do. I think in our generation now, we coddle young people. We sort of deify youth without the recognition that eventually young people get older.
Well, part of the problem you also have
Joan
is that a lot of young, quote-unquote, young people are really 60-plus people, baby boomers, who don't want to admit that they're over 60 and act like they're still in their 20s.
Oh, well, absolutely. Many of the switching points in our culture now are being run by people who were deracinated, uprooted from classical culture in the 1960s and 1970s.
Right.
I mean, we have some people from the Woodstock generation now teaching a whole generation, or failing to teach a whole generation the truth. We see this in politics, the ignorance of the commentary, the low quality of debate. There's no debate now. There's just shouting.
Right.
If people don't like a Supreme Court a nominee, what do? They scream from the balconies and they try to bang down the doors of the Supreme Court. This is a culture in crisis. But getting back to what I was about to say,
right.
Joan of Arc saved France when she was about the age of a high school senior today. Don Juan of Austria saved Western civilization at the Battle of Lepanto when he was 24 years old. Alexander Hamilton was 21 years old when he was a lieutenant general in the Revolutionary War. The average age of a bomber pilot in the Second World War was about that of a college sophomore. None of them looked for safe spaces.
Right, exactly. Now, you also mentioned in the book here, I thought it was interesting, you see, aware that in anxious moments Christ is not asleep, but earlier also quoted Nietzsche about the idea of chaos is what we need so we can give birth to a dancing star. But, you know, Nietzsche also talked about God is dead. Is a lot of the problems that if people still believe God isn't dead, they think he's asleep?
Well, they may think that as a kind of consolation or an encouragement for their own ignorance. Of course, God never sleeps. God is always awake. When the apostles were in that fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee, they thought Jesus was asleep. They said, why doesn't he care what's going on? Our Lord, I would say he was faking being asleep, but even when he slept in his human nature, he was fully aware of what was going on and totally in control.
Now, you say here in the section, getting into one of the resurrection different, that particular article, our culture is becoming neo-pagan, and that is paganism bereft of its frequently benevolent institutions so that it is riddled with neurosis surrounded by the monuments of a civilization that's cracking up. What's the difference between saying something is pagan versus neo-pagan?
Well, there was that famous novel, You Can't Go Home Again, about going home again. A line in it, Look Homeward Angel, by Tom Wolfe, the first novelist, Tom Wolfe. There were two, they're kind of confusing. But it is a fact, we cannot go home again. We can remember the past, that our imagination is part of our soul, part of the intellectual faculty of the soul, but we have selective memory. We can remember bad things. Sometimes our memory is very scarred by bad things. But our Lord says you don't put your hand to the plow and look back. By the same token, we're also encouraged by the future, but we can also be intimidated by the future. The question is, do we want the devil, who's the prince of lies, to make us haunt us by the past, or to learn from the past, which Christ teaches us? Or do we want the devil to make us intimidated by the future rather than hopeful for the future, as our Lord teaches us? But to be neo-pagan is an attempt to go back to the mistakes of the past with all the things we've learned from the present. So, I mean, the pagans enjoyed their ignorance to a certain degree, but once Christ comes into the world and teaches us the truth, we have no excuse to live a lie. C.S. Lewis talks about this. He says, you know, it's like to go back to paganism is as futile as someone trying to go back to virginity. I think now, these days, we have replicated many of the horrors of pagan society: a breakdown of the family, contempt for marriage, contempt for human life through contraception, abortion, and so on, a complete separation of belief from moral behavior. But we, along with it, we don't have the strength of the natural virtues that many of the neo-pagans had. So in the modern age, we can do some of the things that the pagans did, but we can do these things in a worse way because we have a lot more equipment, modern inventions to employ.
Right. Now, also in here, what I thought was interesting, when you were talking about a point you made about the idea that the Romans was inconceivable to the Roman culture and their temple cults that they would have to do anything with morals, and as opposed to what Christianity was pursuing at the time. And you also said, as with the ancient Roman shrines, liberal Protestantism has decayed as a result of denuding ritual of dogma and giving primacy to manners over morals.
Yes, and this is why liberal Protestantism, that is, liberal Protestantism basically are the classical denominations that formed in the 16th century or so, with some antecedents, that have abandoned the theological structure on which they were founded, and so then they became, ironically, more dependent on good works than faith in dogma. It's an irony, because much of Protestantism repudiated justification by works, emphasized faith. Consequently, now, though many such religionists will justify their existence by saying, well, we give to the poor, we're helping to restructure our society and all that. Well, works, faith without works, of course, is vain, but works as a substitute for faith is futile.
Right.
And this has crept into the Catholic Church. I mean, with so many corrupting influences in the Church today, you'll hear, well, so-and-so, Father so-and-so, or Bishop so-and-so, he may have done some bad things, but he was really very concerned for the poor. And the more people emphasize those works as a substitute for faith, then they open the door to the same mistakes that liberalism and Protestantism made, and we see the consequences. Liberal Protestantism basically is just a remnant of what their founders claimed, and it doesn't really really exist now.
Well, you got a great
the challenge now is either the Holy
in the pity of Christ,
the Holy Catholic Church, or secularism.
Right. Now, in the pity of Christ,
that's all there is. I mean, there's nothing in between.
Right. In chapter 2, the pity of Christ, there's a great quote you have from Malcolm Muggeridge here on the great liberal death wish, where he talks about liberalism is the one responsible, a solvent rather than a precipitative, a sedative rather than a stimulant, a sloth rather than a precipice, blurring the edges of truth, the definition of virtue, the shape of beauty, a cracked bell, a mist, a death wish. Why did you include that quote?
Well, first of all, Malcolm Muggeridge said things so beautifully.
Right.
He rather enchants you into the truth. But he lived that experience. He lived through the superficiality of vague modernism. He was brought up as a kind of an evangelical Anglican, abandoned that, tried to be a missionary for a while, abandoned that for much of his life. He came around to the gospel again towards the end of his life, and he knew Mother Teresa. It was largely through his agency that Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa now, of Calcutta, became known to the world, and he was fascinated with holiness, not just her good works. What converted him was not a saint helping the poor, but the power of Christ. Mother Teresa used to say herself, I'm not doing this for the poor, I'm doing this for Christ in the poor. He got to one point when he decided, yes, he could be a believing Christian. And he said to Mother, once she was visiting London, he said, I think I can help the Christian cause more outside the Catholic Church. And he'd been discussing this with many theologians. What was Mother's response? He said, I can help the church better outside rather than in it. And she said, no, you can't. Right. That was it. She engaged no theological argument, and that changed. That's what changed him. So I think his experience very much models that of many people in our generation.
Right. You also, in chapter 3, A River in Egypt, Denying the Undeniable, you use, in Lord Jim, Joseph Conrad wrote, no man ever understands quite his own artful dodges to escape from the grim shadow of self-knowledge. So you see that in our culture today, right?
Well, completely. We have a breakdown in our confidence in truth. We will never know the truth about ourselves unless we know the truth about God who created us. And that is what I mean by the spirit of confusion, which has entered the church, which is supposed to be the ballast of society, the axle on the wheel. Without an axle, the wheel runs out of control. We hear people say, well, we have to make a mess. We have to make a mess of things, and then we'll think things through. God did not come into the world to make a mess. He made all things for his delight and harmony. It's the devil who makes a mess. And right up from the very top in the structure of our church now, we have tremendous confusion, and I think something of what the philosopher would call Hegelianism, the idea that you have one concept of truth here and another concept of truth here, and you sort of synthesize it. It doesn't work that way. Our Lord says, my word is truth. And Christ in the church saves mankind through the truth. The church, the more the church tries to accommodate itself to the world, the more the world confuses the church.
Now, in this section, Telling the Truth, you said, when we are confronted with lying, even in those who are consecrated to the truth, the heartening fact is that when the Prince of Lies wants to twist the truth, he has to twist the church harder. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, the church, the devil's the Antichrist. He's not God. He only has power to the degree that we allow him to have it. But he knows his enemy. His enemy is Christ. In the Bible, it's the devil who says to Jesus, I know who you are. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, all the crowd, they didn't know, but the devil did. And he does. And he knows that the church is his enemy, and that's why he zones in on the church. The corruption of the best, corruptio optimi pessima est, the corruption of the best is the worst. And this is why people are rightly scandalized when professed Christians, church leaders, contradict the moral good. Some people say today that, well, it's the devil who is showing us all the filth around us. No, the devil's the liar. He hides the filth. He's done that for a long time. We look at corruption in our general society, in government, in our schools, but especially in the church. We have to realize that that's been around a long time. And it's the devil who's concealed it, lied to us about that. And whenever you have a church leader smiling and laughing and telling us everything is fine, well, that's a betrayal of the gospel. It's like the crew on the Titanic telling people everything is fine, just don't look at the ice on the upper deck. Right.
You say that in the book. You also talked about the Land O'Lakes conference and the idea of a Catholic university. You say the ambiguous Catholicism of Land O'Lakes invoked a phantasm guised as freedom for truth, but which has nothing more than liberty to reject truth. And then you talked about something that Newman tried to do in Ireland. I thought this was interesting. And it didn't work out. You say the singular difference was that in 1854 they thought the life of the mind might wreck the faith, while in 1967 they thought that the life of the mind was the faith.
The Land O'Lakes Conference, well, it's 50 years ago now, and as we look back, we see that it really was so very destructive. When St. John Paul II wrote his encyclical Centesimus Annus, he specifically referred to the Yalta Conference. Mm-hmm. The Yalta Conference was when Western leaders largely sold out Eastern Europe to the communists, saying, well, you know, they're going to have it anyway, so we have to make the best of a bad mm-hmm. thing. And why did he include that? Well, he was Polish. He knew better than the comfortable bourgeoisie in Europe, in Western Europe, and mm-hmm. the United States. He knew the consequences of that kind of compromise, and I think that that Land O'Lakes Conference was the right. Intellectual university equivalent of Yalta, and we're paying a severe price for that today. And the signatories on that in that thing are I think there's only one signatory, and I think he was recently removed from the College of Cardinals. Right. So right. living a lie does have its right. consequences, right. and I think we have to be honest today. If the Church is really going to come back to reality and reform herself, it's going to have to declare that there are certain institutions, colleges, universities, claiming to be Catholic, but they're Catholic in name only, right. and we have to have honesty right. in labeling. Right. And we have to realize that, like in Yalta, there might have been some fellow travelers even at that particular conference. With that, we're going to have to leave you, Father. Let me just ask you one question. Another work in the works, another book? Well, I always have on the back burner a biography of one of my great heroes, Louis IX, who's a model of what statesmen should be. And I think I have a transcripts of some of my EWTN programs. Right, on truth, I believe. In the works. So yeah. So Sophia Press has put out a 4-volume collection of my pastoral letters, right. just out, and I was rather astonished at how many there were. Right. So we can look for those as well, all available, I'm sure, through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Always great to see you, Father George W. Rutler, the one and only, ensconced in the heart of New York, leading us with Christ in the city. Thank you so much for your time, Father. Thank you, Doug. Good to hear you. And again, the book, Calm in Chaos, Catholic Wisdom for Anxious Time, published by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place to get it. Always worth getting his work. Join us next time right here on Bookmark.